was like a fog that had been over my brain. My entire life had just lifted. The constant mental chatter, the anxiety and depression, it was just gone. I walked to the seafront that morning and it felt like I didn't even touch the ground.
So I want to introduce you to Frank Wright. First off, Frank's first ever conference was Keto Brain Health last year, and this year he's speaking. So I'm very grateful to have Frank here with us today. He's another inspirational story, and following decades of mental health challenges, addictions, and a fast-paced life, in the last 2 years, he's turned his life around. I'm always in awe when I hear Frank's story, and I hope you enjoy listening to him. Please give him a big welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank. I'd just like to start with a simple question. How many of you have ever felt like you were living in a mental fog that you couldn't escape from? Not just me then, that's great. For over 30 years of my life, I lived in that fog. I was told I was a daydreamer by my teachers. I struggled with depression, anxiety, ADHD symptoms, and what I now suspect was autism spectrum disorder. I spent decades trying to escape through drugs, alcohol, and eventually became a professional pastry chef, ironically surrounding myself with the very foods that were destroying my brain. But 15 months ago, something happened that changed everything. In just 48 hours, decades of mental fog lifted. Today, I want to share that story with you, because if it can happen for me, I truly believe it can happen for you too. Let me take you back to where this all began. At 12 years old, I discovered marijuana, and very swiftly after, LSD and harder drugs. By 16, alcohol became my escape. I was using these substances not for fun, but as medication. They were the only thing that could quiet the constant mental chatter, the anxiety and the paranoia that seemed to follow me everywhere. I couldn't concentrate in school. I was always behind and always struggling. I didn't pass a single GCSE. My teachers said I was a daydreamer, but what they didn't understand was that my brain constantly felt like it was underwater. There was one pattern, though, that ran through my entire life: hyper focus. When I found something I loved, I didn't just dabble, I immersed completely. At 7 years old, I was painting citadel miniatures for hours every day. At 12, I got turntables and mixed and scratched records for up to 5 hours a day. In my 20s, I became a jazz drummer and practiced again for 5 hours a day. And I'd be out skateboarding every other moment I wasn't doing these activities. At the age of 16, cooking became that same obsession. I fell in love with the kitchen. I would cook for 3 to 5 hours every day after work. I would devour cookery books every night in bed, studying techniques, flavor combinations, the science behind why things worked. I like to think I became closer to a master in some very complex cuisines, namely Thai cuisine, which is incredibly complicated and involves a lot of ingredients and processes. My friends would back me up on this. I taught more than a few of them how to make perfectly balanced salads and curries that impressed their families. These moments of hyperfocus, this was when my head felt clear. It became my one healthy outlet. But outside of those moments, I was lost. By my mid-20s, my lifestyle had escalated to seriously dangerous levels. I was partying every weekend without fail, using cocaine and ecstasy very heavily, and drinking excessively. I knew I needed to change. So I did what many people do when they're running from themselves. I booked a 2-month trip to Thailand, and I fell in love with the place immediately. The food, the culture, the energy, it felt like somewhere I could start fresh. After those 2 months, I came back to the UK, but I couldn't stop thinking about Thailand. 6 months later, I was on another plane back to Bangkok, but this time to stay. Within my first month there, I got my ESL diploma so I could teach English. I thought geography would solve my problems. But you can't run from your brain chemistry. Even in Thailand, I continued drinking every weekend just to cope with the stress of a new career in teaching. Eventually, I ended up in hospital with gastritis from alcoholism. That was my first wake-up call. I came out of the hospital and knew I needed something to change. So I started running. For 2 years, I got sober and was running 70 miles a week with tempo runs, track sessions, long runs, and maintenance mileage. I was really, really involved, and I got pretty fast. I won a half marathon and consistently came in the top 5, unless there were Kenyans in the race, and I'd be in the top 20. The high of running, feeling my lungs expand, the rush of crossing the finish line, versus the low of drinking, waking up broken every Sunday. There was no comparison. Those were probably the best 2 years of my life up to that point. While I was still in Thailand, I pursued my patisserie diploma at Le Cordon Bleu in Bangkok. When I eventually came back to the UK to pursue my career as a pastry chef, I fell right back into the old patterns. Now, you've probably heard the stories. The restaurant industry has a notorious culture around drugs and alcohol. I was working 70, 80, sometimes even 90-hour weeks, and then destroying myself every weekend. I would barely sleep until Sunday night. This cycle continued for years. I was a professional pastry chef working in some of London's finest restaurants and 5-star hotels, such as the Ritz and the Berkeley, and Michelin-starred restaurants such as Helen de Rose and Pollen Street Social. Later, going on to run a 4-star hotel for 2 years single-handedly. By this point, the addiction had completely taken over my life. I was always behind on my work because I didn't organize myself properly. So I was usually still in the kitchen at 2 a.m. on Friday night after the kitchen porters had gone home. From the outside, it looked like I was successful, but inside, I was dying. Around my mid-30s, I realized something had to change. I started diving into nutrition. Like many people, I started with what seemed healthy, and I went vegan for 6 months after listening to the vegan ultra runner Rich Roll's podcast. And admittedly, I felt terrible. With further research, I discovered Dr. Mark Hyman and learned from one of his guests that you can obtain phytonutrients from grass-fed meat. This led me to Dave Asprey and bulletproof fasting. By this stage, I tried to follow a low-carb diet, but I had such a palate for sugar that I had to have a healthy homemade dessert after every meal. I expect I was never truly in ketosis. I read all of Dr. Gundry's work on lectins and plant toxins, but I still thought the benefits of plants outweighed the negatives. I convinced myself that if I just prepared them correctly, sprouting, fermenting, and soaking, I could get all the good without the bad. I spent the next 5 years of my life on what I thought was an optimized diet. Wild fish, grass-fed meat, but also massive amounts of plant foods. I was growing my own microgreens, sprouting my own sprouts, and fermenting my sourdough for as long as 48 hours to reduce unwanted compounds such as phytic acid. I felt I was doing everything right according to the experts. Cold plunging every morning, sauna 3 to 4 times a week, lifting heavy, sprinting, meditating, journaling. I had red light therapy. I was taking 30 supplements a day. I was the picture of a biohacker, but I was still deeply depressed. During this time, my father's health was declining. He'd been an athletics coach for the past 15 years, averaging himself 18 miles a day. I have his logs to prove that. But he followed the old carb loading advice made famous by Professor Tim Noakes and his book, The Law of Running, of which my father passed on to me when I started my running journey. Interestingly, Professor Tim Noakes, once a leading advocate of high-carb nutrition, now eats roughly 95% carnivore, and he has successfully managed his own type 2 diabetes through this way of eating. And he has even moved to revise his own literature to reflect what he's experienced firsthand. But back then, the advice was all about carbohydrates. My father would eat half a loaf of bread for breakfast, no exaggeration, 5 to 10 potatoes at every meal, and up to 10 pieces of fruit per day. And his diet contained nearly no animal protein or fat. After he stopped coaching, he developed type 2 diabetes. And 2 years after that, Lewy Body Dementia. Watching him decline was heartbreaking. It was slow at first, but became more apparent in the last 4 years before his death. We had carers with him, and he became increasingly difficult towards them. They were all very different characters, and some he got on better with than others. But he became very, very difficult and someone unlike himself, often a little bit rude, offensive, and abrasive. Really, unfortunately, not a fault of his own. Then in the last year, he became too much for the carers. We moved him between facilities, first to an adequately staffed dementia home where he nearly died from malnutrition, then to a hospital for 3 months where he briefly improved before a COVID outbreak isolated him from visitors and he deteriorated again. We finally got him to a good facility with well-trained staff, but he was far too gone by then. Those last visits were very painful. On New Year's Day, I got a message in the morning saying I should probably come because it might be his last day. I got to the train and arrived 30 minutes too late to see him before he died, which I don't know was probably better than watching him die, but that's that. When my father died, I finally got sober for good. But that first year of sobriety was the hardest year of my life. Despite doing everything right nutritionally, or so I thought, despite all my biohacking, I was more depressed than ever. I was coming to terms with who I really was without substances to mask it. During that darkest period, I went to the doctor to discuss antidepressants. Instead, I took an ADHD and autism assessment and scored 33 out of 36 for autism. Now, so I'm not formally diagnosed, but suddenly so much of my life makes sense. Now, I'd heard about the carnivore diet for years. I'd listened to Dr. Sean Baker, Paul Saladino, and others in this space, but I always thought it was too extreme. I was convinced I needed all those plant foods for their polyphenols and fiber, but I was desperate. I'd tried everything. So 15 months ago, I decided to give it a shot. I remember it clearly. It was a Sunday. I had a very meat-heavy breakfast with my last piece of homemade sourdough bread. That evening, I had a completely animal-based dinner. Monday, I committed fully, just beef, lamb, eggs, and a little homemade ketchup I made from tomato concentrate, allulose, and raw apple cider vinegar to make the transition smoother. I felt fine the first day, interesting, but nothing dramatic. But Tuesday morning, that second day, I woke up and felt like a completely different person. I cannot overstate this. It was like a fog that had been over my brain. My entire life had just lifted. The constant mental chatter, the anxiety and depression, it was just gone. I walked to the seafront that morning and it felt like I didn't even touch the ground. I actually got out my phone and recorded myself because I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. It's very out of character for such an introvert. I was crying with relief, but also crying partly with anger. Relief that I finally felt clear, anger that it had taken this long to find it, and the answer being so simple. For the first time in my adult life, my mind was quiet and clear. That was 15 months ago, and I haven't looked back. Now, I'm not a doctor or researcher like many of the other speakers here today, but I want to share what I believe happened in my brain during those 48 hours. For years, I was consuming massive amounts of plant compounds, oxalates, lectins, phytates, salicylates. My gut was constantly inflamed from all the fiber I thought I needed. My blood sugar was on a roller coaster despite eating healthy carbs. When I went carnivore, several things happened simultaneously. First, I eliminated all the plant toxins that were causing chronic inflammation in my brain. We now know that neuroinflammation is a major driver of depression, anxiety, and brain fog. Second, I stabilized my blood sugar and insulin levels. No more glucose spikes and crashes that were driving mood swings and energy crashes. Third, I entered a state of nutritional ketosis. My brain finally had a clean, steady fuel source. Ketones are the brain's preferred fuel, and they have neuroprotective properties. Fourth, I was finally getting truly bioavailable nutrition. All the nutrients in meat are in forms my body can actually use, unlike the bound up nutrients in plants that require conversion. And the result, my brain could finally function the way it was designed to. Now, I jumped in overnight, which isn't the recommended way, but I was desperate. I got off pretty lightly with a small headache on day 5. When I first started, I was ravenously hungry, eating up to 2 kilos of meat a day. Even with that, I dropped down to 62 kilograms, which was actually way underweight for me. But over the next 6 months, I gained 8 kilograms and have held there steady ever since. Looking back, I believe that hunger was my body in deep repair mode. For decades, I'd been starving at a cellular level, not from lack of calories, but from lack of actual nutrients. My body was finally getting the complete proteins, the bioavailable vitamins, the minerals it had been desperately crying for. That initial weight loss, my body was likely clearing out damaged tissue, dealing with inflammation, resetting systems that had been broken for years. Then came the rebuild. As I adjusted my fat to protein ratios and added resistance training, my body started laying down healthy tissue, real muscle, not just weight. My appetite normalized as leptin and ghrelin rebalanced. The constant hunger faded because my cells were finally satisfied. Repair takes time, and it takes more nutrients than maintenance. That's why I needed so much food early on. My body wasn't being greedy, it was fixing 30 years of damage. These days, I eat about a kilo of meat with some additional occasional butter, cheese, and eggs. I do eat oily fish a few times a week and throw in some organs where possible. Today, I sleep better with less sleep. My sleep quality has improved dramatically, even though I need fewer hours. I have mental clarity I never thought possible. The constant anxiety and depression that plagued me for decades is simply gone. I haven't had a single thought about alcohol and drugs. The cravings for sugar, remember, I was a pastry chef, completely disappeared. I can walk past a bakery now and feel absolutely nothing, except maybe my admiration for the perfect lamination of a croissant or the mirror glaze of an entremet. People often ask me, what did you do to actually get better? And honestly, that's why I recently retrained as a naturopathic practitioner, because I realized that what happened to me wasn't a miracle, it was biochemistry. And if it worked for someone as damaged as I was, it can work for others too. The beautiful thing about this approach is that while the carnivore diet was the foundation of my transformation, I've learned things along the way that have enhanced it even further. I learned what real hunger actually feels like. Not cravings, not boredom, not emotional emptiness, masked as appetite, but genuine physical hunger. I discovered how adjusting my eating timing could dramatically improve my sleep quality. I found that cold exposure and saunas now feel like the icing on the cake of how good I can feel every single day. I learned to listen to my body's signals instead of fighting against them. Each insight built on the last, creating a deeper understanding of how my body actually works when you give it the right inputs. What I didn't expect was how carnivore would obliterate not just my sugar addiction, but all my addictions. When you're truly satiated, and I mean genuinely full at a cellular level, the compulsion to reach for something, anything, just disappears. Animal foods are so nutrient dense, so satisfying, that your body finally stops screaming for more. There's no blood sugar roller coaster driving you to the fridge an hour after eating, no inflammatory cascade clouding your judgment. The dopamine-seeking behavior that drove my substance abuse, it quietened down when my brain had the fuel it actually needed. Stable ketones instead of sugar spikes, complete proteins with all the amino acids for neurotransmitter production. The fat-soluble vitamins my brain was starving for. When your biochemistry is right, the cravings lose their grip. And remember, I used to take 30 supplements a day. Now, I don't take any supplements at all, except for occasional use of Richard's incredible MCTs, ketones, and electrolytes. So if you're sitting here today, feeling like you've tried everything, like nothing works for you, I want you to know that there's hope. Sometimes the answer isn't adding more things, more supplements, more therapies, more complexity. Sometimes the answer is taking things away. For me, it was taking away the very foods I thought were keeping me healthy. I'm living proof this transformation is possible. And if my story resonates with you, I'd love to connect and share more about what made this possible. Thank you.